There's a moment in your life when you look in the mirror and realize you're carrying a weight you never agreed to hold. A heaviness you didn't choose, a story that didn't start with you, but somehow became your responsibility to finish. And maybe you've never spoken it out loud, but deep down, you know the truth. The person you became, or the person you're afraid of becoming, is tied to the man who raised you, or the man who didn't. This isn't about blame. This isn't about pointing fingers at a parent who probably wasn't taught any better. It's about something quieter, something you feel when you're alone and every distraction fades, leaving only the question you've avoided for years. Why do I feel so weak? Why do I struggle with things that seem so simple for others? Why do I keep fighting invisible battles that no one else seems to see? And the answer, at least the beginning of it, often leads back to your father. A father does not just raise a child, he raises their inner voice. The voice you hear when you doubt yourself. The voice you hear when you're trying to impress someone. The voice you hear when you fail. The voice you hear when you're afraid to take your next step. For some people that voice is supportive. For others it's harsh. For many it's absent. But for you, maybe it became a voice that makes you shrink instead of rise. A voice that makes you hesitate instead of act. A voice that repeats old patterns you inherited without realizing it. And maybe you've asked yourself, why do I feel so unsure? Why do I crumble under pressure? Why do I avoid things that could make my life better? It's not because you're weak by nature. It's because you were trained to breathe in a world built by someone else's fears. Think about how a child learns strength. Children watch how their parents respond to life. They learn whether the world is safe or dangerous, whether emotions are something to express or something to hide. If your father raised you with silence, you learn to silence yourself. If he raised you with anger, you learn to walk on emotional eggshells. If he raised you with impossible standards, you learn that nothing you do is ever enough. If he was absent, you learn to question your own worth. If he was unpredictable, you learn to overthink everything. If he wanted you to be strong by not feeling, you learn to confuse numbness with strength. If he never apologized, you learned that admitting mistakes is dangerous. If he demanded perfection, you developed anxiety disguised as ambition. If he avoided discomfort, you learned avoidance as a coping strategy. If he lived life shrinking from his own potential, you inherited a blueprint for shrinking from yours. None of this makes him a bad person. It makes him human. But it also means you grew up defending yourself from things you never should have had to defend yourself from. And maybe that's why you feel weak now. Not because you are weak, because you grew up in survival mode. You were learning how to read his moods instead of learning how to understand your own. You were learning how not to upset him instead of learning how to express yourself. And survival mode changes the brain. That's not poetry, that's neuroscience. Studies have shown that environments shaped by unpredictability or emotional distance affect the development of stress pathways, confidence, and decision-making. You might feel stuck today not because you're limited, but because your nervous system was trained from childhood to anticipate danger instead of possibility. Think about how much of you was shaped by trying to solve someone else's emotional puzzle. How you learned to hide your true self because being seen felt unsafe. That's not weakness. That's adaptation. That's your mind protecting itself the only way it knew how. But here's where life becomes complicated. What protected you in the past becomes the very thing that limits you in adulthood. You learned emotional freezing as a child, and now you call it indecision. You learned self-doubt early, and now you call it humility. You learned to avoid conflict, and now you call it peace. You learned to depend on no one, and now you call it strength. You learned to expect little, and now you call it realism. You learned to stay small, and now you call it your personality. What if you aren't choosing these things? What if these things were chosen for you? Because here's the truth you've probably never said out loud. Your relationship with your father became the blueprint for how you relate to yourself. If your father never supported your dreams, you learned to distrust your own. If your father rarely expressed pride, you learned to perform for validation rather than for fulfillment. If your father didn't know how to handle emotion, you learned to suppress your own until they became too heavy to manage. If your father carried unresolved fears, you inherited the emotional echoes. And maybe what you call weakness is actually inherited self-protection. But let me tell you something important. You don't have to continue the story you were handed. People underestimate how deeply a father's energy imprints itself on a child, not through lectures, but through presence, through tone, through behavior, through what he does when life becomes difficult, through the parts of himself he never healed. A father unconsciously teaches you what to fear. A father teaches you what strength looks like. A father teaches you how to view yourself. And if he struggled with his own inner battles, he might have unintentionally passed them to you. Not through intention, but through example. You may have grown up believing that emotional restraint is strength, that silence is maturity, that never needing help is independence, that self-sacrifice is love, that overworking is responsibility, that exhaustion is normal, that your worth must be proven, not felt. But look at how much of that has collapsed under you. Look at how tired you are. Look at how disconnected you feel from yourself. Look at how hard you fight internal battles no one sees. Look at how you doubt every decision you make. Look at how you replay conversations for hours. Look at how uncomfortable you feel when someone praises you. Look at how guilty you feel when you rest. Look at how impossible it is to say what you really feel. Look at how numb you've become around things that should bring joy. This isn't weakness, this is emotional conditioning. And people rarely talk about it because no one wants to admit that the person who shaped them most also created invisible battles they've carried into adulthood. But healing begins with honesty. And honesty begins here. You didn't become this way alone. You learned your habits, your defenses, your reactions, your fears, your hesitations, your expectations, your emotional patterns, your definitions of strength and weakness. They were taught subtly, quietly, consistently by the environment you grew up in. And when people tell you, just be confident, they don't realize you were raised in an environment where confidence felt like danger, where being too loud, too bold, too honest, too expressive, too emotional, too independent could create tension or judgment. But here's the part no one told you. You can outgrow the emotional blueprint you were given. Just because you inherited patterns doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat them. Just because you were shaped by someone else's limitations doesn't mean you can't rise beyond them. Just because your father couldn't show you a certain type of strength doesn't mean you can't learn it yourself. And this is where your story starts to change. Because at some point, life gives you two choices. Continue being shaped by the past, or reshape yourself in the present. And the truth is, the moment you even become aware of these patterns, the moment something inside you says, wait, maybe this isn't who I really am, that is the beginning of strength. The very fact that you're questioning your emotional inheritance means you've already taken the first step your father maybe never knew how to take. And that's not weakness. That's evolution. But before you can rebuild yourself, you have to face something difficult, something most people avoid their entire lives. You have to see your father not just as a parent, but as a person with fears, a person with doubts, a person shaped by his own upbringing, a person who may have never received the emotional tools he needed, a person who survived rather than thrived, a person who loved in the only way he knew how, even if that way left you feeling unseen, a person who might have carried burdens he never had words for. Understanding this doesn't excuse anything, but it explains everything. And when you understand the origin of your patterns, you stop feeling defective and start feeling aware. Awareness is the first form of freedom. Awareness is how you begin rewriting your story. Awareness is how you stop inheriting struggles that were never yours to keep. And once you begin that process, something shifts. A quiet strength begins to form. Not the strength your father modeled, but a new kind of strength. A strength rooted in self-understanding. A strength built on awareness. A strength that grows not from pretending to be invulnerable, but from understanding what made you vulnerable in the first place. But here's where the story quietly shifts. Because once you begin to see your father as a human being, rather than an unshakable figure, something inside you softens. Not in a way that makes you weak, but in a way that makes you finally honest with yourself. You start realizing that the version of him you grew up with wasn't the full version. It was the version shaped by his own history, his own upbringing, his own fears he never dared to name. Maybe he never learned how to express care. Maybe he didn't know how to apologize. Maybe he never received patience, so he didn't know how to offer it. Maybe he never saw vulnerability modeled, so he avoided his own emotions. Maybe he mistook seriousness for strength. Maybe he confused control with protection. Maybe he believed silence meant safety because that's what he was taught. And these pieces of him became pieces of you. But here's the turning point. Once you understand the origin of your patterns, you gain the power to challenge them. You start noticing moments where you act out of habit, not truth. You start catching yourself repeating emotional reflexes that don't belong to you anymore. You begin recognizing that your inner critic isn't your voice. It's an echo from someone who never learned how to speak kindly to themselves. And that realization is the beginning of maturity, because growing up isn't just about paying bills or becoming independent. Growing up is the slow, sometimes painful process of separating your identity from your upbringing. It's learning to look at the emotional rules you inherited and asking, does this still serve me? It's discovering that strength doesn't come from repeating old patterns. It comes from breaking them. And maybe that's where you've been stuck for years, not because you lack ability, but because you've never questioned the invisible rules your childhood wrote inside you. Rules like, keep everything inside, don't burden anyone, handle everything yourself, stay quiet, stay polite, stay stable, stay predictable, don't disappoint, don't express too much, don't ask for help, don't be too much, don't be too honest, don't show weakness. But look at what those rules cost you. They taught you how to endure, but not how to live. They taught you how to function, but not how to feel. They taught you how to adapt, but not how to become yourself. They taught you how to avoid breaking down, but not how to build up. You survived your childhood patterns, but surviving isn't the same as growing. And this is the part that requires courage. Questioning the rules you inherited will feel like betrayal, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your mind associates those rules with safety. They protected you once. They kept the peace. They kept you from conflict. They kept you from judgment. They kept you from discomfort. But you're not that child anymore, and the threats you prepared for don't exist anymore. Yet a part of you still lives as if they do. That's why you avoid difficult conversations. That's why you struggle with expressing emotion. That's why you feel nervous when someone asks what you really want. That's why you hesitate before speaking your mind. That's why you feel responsible for the feelings of everyone around you. That's why you overthink even small decisions. That's why you close off when you most need connection. That's why you shrink when the moment calls you to rise. That's why you chase validation instead of truth. That's why you exhaust yourself trying to be the version of you that keeps everyone comfortable. These are not random habits. They are inherited self-protection mechanisms. But there comes a moment, quiet, often unexpected, when you realize the life you're living isn't the life you truly want. It's the life you learn to maintain, and maintaining something that never belonged to you is the most exhausting thing in the world. So let me ask you something gently but directly. When was the last time you asked yourself who you would be if you weren't trying to meet the standards of the father you grew up with? Not the ideal father, not the perfect father, not the father you wish he had been, but the father he actually was. Who would you be if you weren't trying to avoid his disapproval? Who would you be if you weren't afraid of repeating his mistakes? Who would you be if you stopped living in the emotional shadow of his silence, his expectations, his unpredictability, his distance? Maybe this is the moment you realize that your weakness isn't lack of strength, it's lack of permission. Permission you've been waiting your whole life to receive without realizing you can grant it to yourself. Because here's the truth no one told you. You can outgrow the environment that shaped you. You can evolve beyond the patterns you inherited. You can become someone your father never had the chance to become. You can heal wounds he never acknowledged. You can break cycles he didn't know how to escape. You can build an inner world he never experienced. And none of that is betrayal. It's continuation. It's expansion. It's choosing growth where he chose survival. You're not rejecting him by becoming more. You're honoring the part of him that wanted more but didn't know how to reach it. And maybe, on some deep, unspoken level, that's what he wanted for you all along. But this transformation won't come from sudden breakthroughs. It won't come from one moment of clarity. It won't come from dramatic decisions. Real change is slower, quieter. It comes from small shifts repeated consistently. It comes from choosing a new response in situations where your old patterns would normally take over. It happens the moment you pause before shrinking. The moment you express something small you would have once hidden. The moment you ask for help without feeling guilty. The moment you stand your ground calmly. The moment you let yourself rest without shame. The moment you stop over-explaining yourself. The moment you allow discomfort without running from it. The moment you choose honesty over avoidance. The moment you forgive yourself for things you learned, not things you chose. These moments accumulate, slowly, steadily, quietly, and over time they build a new internal voice, one that replaces the echo of your father's limitations with a voice that sounds more like you, not the conditioned you, not the obedient you, not the protected you, but the real you, the one who has been waiting for years beneath the surface. The you who wants to take risks without fearing judgment. The you who wants to speak without rehearsing. The you who wants to feel without apologizing. The you who wants to build something meaningful, not just acceptable. The you who wants to stop pretending everything is fine. The you who wants to break free from inherited expectations. The you who wants to live with purpose, not compliance. And maybe that version of you feels distant. Maybe it feels unreachable. Maybe you don't know where to begin. But every transformation begins with one simple realization. You are not responsible for the emotional gaps your father carried. You are only responsible for what you choose to carry forward. Your father's strength shaped you, but so did his weaknesses, so did his fears, so did his silence, so did his insecurities, so did his unhealed parts. But now, you have something he didn't: awareness. Awareness is the first doorway to change, and once you walk through it, something remarkable happens. You realize you're not becoming weaker by confronting your past. You're becoming stronger by understanding it. Because real strength isn't the absence of emotion. Real strength is acknowledging your patterns without judging yourself for them. Real strength is seeing your father clearly, his best and his worst, without letting either define your future. Real strength is choosing growth even when it feels unfamiliar. Because that unfamiliar feeling, that's how you know you're becoming someone new. And maybe one day when you look back, you'll realize something powerful. The very thing you once called weakness was actually the starting point of your transformation. It was the signal that something inside you needed more. More guidance, more understanding, more safety. And freedom is what this entire journey has been leading you toward. Freedom from the echo of a father who didn't know how to guide you in the ways you needed. You are allowed to build your own definition of strength, one rooted in awareness, compassion, courage, honesty, and self-respect. And the most powerful part? You don't have to wait for permission. You can begin right here, right now, with nothing more than a quiet decision. Your story continues with you. Not with the patterns you inherited, not with the weight you carried, not with the limits you were taught, but with the strength you are discovering within yourself. And as you move forward, you might begin to see something unexpected, something almost gentle. You were never weak because of your father. You only believed you were. What you called weakness was the first step toward becoming stronger than the generation before you. And that strength, your strength, is only beginning to unfold.